Hello, heretics. This is Lilith. I'm here with Renee, and we are Veritas Voices. Well, my heathens, it's time for another talk on topics related to faith and religion, which are not always quite the same thing, although they are definitely broadly overlapping magisteria. This week we have something that's made the rounds a few times. It's just I grant you not all Christian groups are quite this rigid in their authority structures, but we've mentioned many times before that the concept of authority being the basis of everything is something that religions rely on because they're very primitive, and that was the sort of first functional way we got out of total chaos. It's definitely not the best system, but it was better than nothing. So, yay? Yeah. So obviously, that's super fun. And Renee found this little gem. Why don't you describe what this looks like to you, Renee?
Okay, so this was a tweet by a girl named Taylor. She has posted a graphic and was just asking the Twitterverse. I would love to hear thoughts on this, and what I see there is pretty much like something that you also typically see, like comparison Jesus on one side, Satan on the other side, and then basically Jesus is it's like sort of a threefold umbrella. And on one side, Jesus is pretty much on top of the food chain, and he basically he has the biggest umbrella because, of course, he has. He then is basically in charge, and he gives instructions to the husband on how to lead a successful marriage, and he sort of guides the husband how to basically then be a husband and to take care of his family and that sort of stuff. And then says below that the husband is called to protect and to provide for the family, and basically in doing that he fulfills the will of God. And at the bottom there is a wife who basically has her role within the household, which is basically taking care of the children and taking care of the household. And
yes, she gets a tiny bit of authority over the children and making sure everything is neat and clean. Isn't that lovely? The umbrella system here is meant to show a system of higher levels of authority. It probably looks a bit foreign to most people. But please go on with the second half.
Basically, she is then called to be the stereotypical housewife, and on the other side, then we have Satan, who basically wants to undermine this God-ordained order, and he's evil, and he wants to corrupt the system, and that's basically the critique that this meme, I guess, is supposed to offer of modern society, where a woman is empowered and where a woman also has a job and does not necessarily take care of the children, but maybe leaves that to the husband, or leaves that to a nanny or whatever. And there on that side, you then see the wife being sort of above the husband, and in the wife basically also taking on maybe all of the duties that God would have ordained for the husband, or maybe them sharing the duties that.
Oh yeah, there's no sense of equality in this system. If the man is not in charge, then the woman is in charge, and that's because Satan. Logic. Now, I asked you because I did grow up with this type of attitude. I am familiar with it. I grew up with this at the beginning. It became much less like this as things went on. But it's not totally unfamiliar to me. I'm assuming that this is not something you had any familiarity with growing up. Would I be correct?
I didn't have any familiarity with that within my household, at least. Like, I knew that there were maybe other households where that would have been the case, but within my household, basically, my mom, being the judge that she was pretty much the breadwinner. But my dad also went to work, so they both earned money, and basically, I was then taken care of by both, or I was going to kindergarten, or my grandmother also had my grandmother also helped in raising me and teaching me stuff, and yeah.
So I get the impression that no one was in charge among your parents. I mean, obviously, your parents were more in charge than you because they were parents.
Yeah,
But
obviously.
between them, there was nobody who was the boss. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's very accurate. Like, when it came to decision making within a household, when it came to decision making about how to raise me, when it came to decision making what activities we do, pretty much any decision, my parents talked about it. They had a dialogue, and then they came to an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
It was all about communication, and that's basically how it all worked out. And there was nobody within that bond that my parents had, where one had the deciding vote and the other person did not. Like, it was either both an agreement, or yeah, nobody wins.
Fair enough. So I'm gonna guess. Okay, have you ever heard the phrase, "The man is the head of the household"?
I do think that I have heard the phrase from again within my past, from other households, more conservative households, but it's not a phrase that
It didn't. Did it mean anything to you as a kid?
when I heard that, it depends obviously on what stage as a it didn't mean anything to me when I was 4 years old. It did mean something to me when I was, say, 8 or 9 years old. But
Mm-hmm.
when I heard that, I was just taken aback, because I didn't know that kind of system, and from my personal experience, I did know that this was a system that others adhere to, but this was not a system that I found at all agreeable, or that
You didn't feel the need to express your authority as a man?
I didn't find this kind of system sensible or even remotely appealing, and it didn't make sense to me.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I can understand how not growing up with it, it really wouldn't.
How did you grow up with, and how did you perceive it in your childhood?
In my childhood, I've tried to explain to people that I was brought up very much with the concept of authority being fundamental for the functioning of, well, anything really. And that's, it. You realize after the fact how completely weird and messed up that is. But of course, as a child, you don't. And my parents, I would say, inherited this as a doctrinal burden. My mother grew up in the 70s, and she was the second youngest of 5 children. There were 3 daughters, and the eldest was very much of the old traditional school of you just submit to your husband, and your husband everything, and he makes all the decisions, and you know the rest of it. Which I can assure you, in her marriage, did not make for a healthy interaction. But whereas my mother had imbibed some more of the culture of equality. So there was this strange dichotomy where my mother behaved and thought of herself as very equal, and yet there was this whole conversation and dialogue of authority. when I was very young, when they were more into these charismatic evangelical groups, there was this whole system of authority that was explained to me, this concept that spiritual authority and headship could affect everyone underneath it in perhaps unspecified ways. The example being, if a pastor was engaging in sexual sin or something, you'd often find that would spread throughout the congregation, which of course was attributed to his poor spiritual headship and having left kind of a hole in his umbrella, if you want to use this metaphor, although this particular image wasn't part of my life.
So if I were to translate that, or basically, would it be fair to say that basically his behavior in his private life, where he behaves sexually immoral, this would very much affect his views, and this would therefore translate to how he conducts his preaching and his congregation, and how
that would be what would happen in reality. In this spiritual authority sense, that's not the dialogue. What's happening in the minds of those who hold to this particular bit of banality, it's more a case of he has opened the door to the devil in this area. And thus those under him are affected in a spiritual way and made more vulnerable to these sins.
Okay.
So yeah, it's you have to remember everything is magic because reasons.
So basically, he was tempted by Satan, and therefore Satan is now in full force. And once Satan has gotten the pastor, then Satan can also take control over the congregation.
Yeah, a lot like that. And also a case of, in this case, Satan he's sort of empowered. There's this idea that wherever you give up your power as a Christian, Satan takes power. There's this idea that everything is a dichotomy. It's either God or Satan. There's this old illustration used when we were kids that, you couldn't sit on the fence because, Satan owned the fence. Basically, if you didn't choose a side between light and dark, Satan would get you because Satan owns the fence.
Yeah.
Not sure why.
Basically, that would be the presuppositional doctrine of no neutrality, or as Jesus said, you're either with me or you're against me.
Oh, yeah. And isn't that a lovely toxic doctrine? But yay.
So basically, if I understand this meme correctly, it would also mean that if you deviate from God's ways, from the ways of the Bible, then if you say have equality within marriage, or even let the woman be in charge, then this is basically Satan controlling the entire thing, and it's Satan causing you to adopt this different system.
Well, and it's not just Satan. There's this idea that there is a proper order of things that involves this authority being, in a sense, inherent in the system of nature. Like, if we do something that directly conflicts with how a thing is supposed to work, it won't work as well. So God's system is for everything to work according to authorita. Yeah. Which means that whenever you don't employ that in the correct way, you're empowering Satan. Yeah. And of course, let's not ignore the fact that woman is put much closer to Satan and man is put closer to Jesus Christ. And again, this is very, 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 very typical.
One thing I want to ask you, because you said that basically there's this God-ordained order, and there are certain things in place that have to work in a certain way, and if you don't adhere to that system, then it does work that well. And can you maybe, apart from the meme that we're just discussing, maybe give a different example so that I have a better idea of it?
Okay, well, again, you have to think of spiritual authority as essentially being magic power.
Yeah.
And whoever, doesn't, wherever you don't do things according to the will of God, you are investing Satan with spiritual authority. And this was a burden on men and women. It's okay. My father is a very good man.
Yeah.
He's a very good man, and he loves his family, and he was taught this doctrine. So and this is why I say it's important to investigate individuals and their actions and motivations, even within what might be termed a bad group. Yeah. Because if you believe this, if you're taught to believe this, there are different ways you can react. We see a lot of men reacting by being tyrannical, egocentric assholes.
Yeah. Taking advantage of the system.
Yeah. My father did his best not to do that. I would say that he wanted to make the best, do the best in the system that he could. So my father described this to me as, if something goes wrong, if the family doesn't go right, if there's some error, it's not going to be, Mom, what did you do wrong? It's going to be, Dad, what did you do wrong? That God is going to come and demand answers of him. And even so many years later, and so much of that really strict authoritarian bullshit unwound, when I last visited them, my father said to me, he was looking at me kind of funny, and I was like, what's up? And he's like, he basically expressed that fear that if I wasn't a Christian, it was his fault in some sense. That, is God going to demand an answer of him because I am no longer faithful? And I remember thinking, like, Dad, you did all you could to make me a believer. And my father is very sincere. He would have many nights when he couldn't sleep, so he would stay up praying in the big chair, just praying constantly. And that's it. That he would just stay there and pray until he fell asleep. I mean, that's as sincere as you can get.
Yeah. So did he then also, in a way, pray for you to come back to the faith?
I think he's more at the stage of leaving that with God now, for which I'm eternally grateful. But yeah, it is something that, they did pray for when I was a child. They prayed for my future husband from the time I was born, probably. And they prayed that I would be a believer. Those are the things they prayed for. Those may very well still be the things that they pray for. And it's difficult to realize what a burden was placed on them, to feel that everything I did was their responsibility. I mean, they talk about the patriarchy being toxic for men as well. It really is. My father, even as he works his way out of a lot of these ideas, still has in the back of his mind the fear that God is going to come and say, why isn't your daughter following me?
Basically because he sees himself as responsible because this hierarchy is placed there. And
exactly.
Yeah.
Even as an adult, he sort of felt it necessary to say, you know what, I release you to your adult life, because I wasn't one of those who married at 18. So he had to sort of hand me over to myself in an authority way. And again, I'm talking about a man who is trying to view this in the best way possible. And even who said to me once that sometimes being the man and the head of the house and the authority means you do things your way. And sometimes it means you do things your wife's way because you care about her and you don't, you need to put her needs first sometimes. So while the system is still horribly toxic and just fucks up everybody, there are still people within it who believe it's right because that's what they were taught, and who try to do it in very good, ethical ways. It's sort of the benevolent tyrant thing.
So basically, you have this doctrine, but your father then says, well, there's this doctrine, but I do my best to still treat my wife faithfully, and to still, within that doctrine, try to give her as much power as God would.
Yeah, as much power as he's allowed to. And the idea being with headship in our host was, obviously we talk about it first, but if we can't agree, he gets the casting vote. Which again, a little bit bullshit, but definitely not the same as, the kind of shut up and do what I say because I's a man kind of an attitude.
So pretty much we should first discuss it, and we should try to come to a consensus, but if we can't come to a consensus, then, well, I just decide.
Yeah. It basically, they employed it as a
last resort,
as a backup plan, which meant that, of course, that my mother would still have opinions and would still discuss, if she made a good case for whatever her perspective was, then yeah, we'd do it that way because she,
made a good case.
Yeah, which, again, that's not the part that's the problem. The part that's the problem is the idea that, just the whole idea that it has to be an authority. And, the only time you need that type of function is when you're in life and death situations, and immediate, quick decisions have to be made and everyone follows them. That's why authority systems are used in the army, because you don't have time for a meeting and a committee when you're under fire. You just got to go and act quickly. And sometimes even a bad decision is better than no decision at all.
Yeah.
When you have time, though, that's definitely not the best way to do things.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like I said, this is an example of someone trying to do this as well as they can, someone who genuinely understands ethics and wants to do right. And that those people do exist within. They're not generally the ones passing around these memes about how Satan is the head of the wife if you put her in charge. They tend to be a little more nuanced, but that's also, then you're not going to think of them as being that type, and those ideas and ideology can kind of fly under the radar.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, what was your next question?
My next question, so what would this imply for basically raising children? Would this then also mean that the husband doesn't really participate in the raising of the children, and he leaves it to the mother, but he's also simultaneously responsible for her actions? Or how does this hierarchy affect this hierarchy, or this how does basically the decisions that the mother makes in raising the children, is he also culpable for that within that hierarchical system?
The short answer is yes. Again, okay, I'm going to go with the more extreme Duggarish types because that's who's going to pass around this type of a meme. But looking at it in terms of responsibility, yes, ideally the man would choose a good wife who would bring up the children properly, according to the appropriate authority system. And she would obviously make all the minor decisions to manage things, because things have to be managed. But the major decisions he would be able to trump any decision she made, and she would have to submit to his authority. Again, this was very reversed when I grew up. There was a period in the 80s where the economy was in the tank, and like my parents were both, let's just both apply for jobs. And my mom got a job first, and my dad stayed home with us and took courses in the evening. He was a champ. He was an absolute champ, taking care of everything. But they still understood that to be, he's preparing himself to, taking these courses to, get a better job in future. And mom is, they found a way to work that into their system in a sense of just, we're both doing what we need to. That doesn't mean he's not the head. But again, it made for much more equality in practice than in, I guess, speech, which can again explain how people can spout these horrible ideas and yet say, no, it's not really like that. Because if they experience something closer to what I experienced, then their experience of authority wasn't this tyrannical, do as I say thing. So, yeah, the idea is still bad, but the playing out varies dramatically.
So basically it was then arranged that, like your mom made the money and she got the job, and then to be pragmatic, then he took care of other duties, but still this idea of him being the head of household was still in place.
Yeah, and that he was doing the, the schooling to get better jobs in future, etc. So, and like I said, he was a champ. There were very young children in the house at that point. So he took care of a lot of stuff. He was great that way. He really was. And taking courses in the evening, not easy. He was not one of those, oh, you're home from work, make me a sandwich.
Yeah.
Sitting on my ass all day. Nope. Yeah. So that's, again, it's kind of, like I said, my father is a good man. He's better than the ideas that he was ambushed with. Yeah. Manipulated into.
Yeah. But I think we also got a quote from Leon. I think he provided that quote.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's kind of interesting because sexual sin is something that was really quite rampant in. It's funny, the more authoritarian and evangelical and hyper legalistic a church is, the more likely that some really horrible sexual shit is going on in the background. In one case, a church my parents left, they found out much later that the pastor had been basically insisting that these women have sex with him who were from other countries and didn't speak English very well. They went to him for counseling, and he counseled them with his dick. And they didn't understand what was going on and didn't think it was right, but they couldn't really tell anybody except their husbands, and that would be very awkward. So basically he was
in a position of power and he abused it.
He was raping these women. Yeah, absolutely. And it was so there are the more authoritarian, and this isn't just in my own life. You can look, the pastor having an affair can happen in every denomination, but the pastor who's doing something really horrific to the vulnerable, abusing their power in terrible ways, the worse the crime, the more likely that they are super freaking conservative and authority. And see, this is not seen as a problem with the system. It's seen as them not doing their duty as a head to shield. And Lincoln pointed out that if Mary, the mother of Jesus, was around, she would be the face of the Me Too movement, because she was basically a child when God knocked her up via magic, totes, for real.
Yeah. One thing which I want to say about this person, because you said because like he was very powerful and he abused this point. This is also something that we obviously see regularly in our life, and I think that's I don't know where this quote comes from. Maybe you know, but it's a very famous quote, and that is, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely."
Mm-hmm. It is. It is a very famous quote. And that's it too. I mean, the more the system protects those in power as opposed to those who are vulnerable, the easier it is to get away with things.
Yeah.
And the worse those things become. And it's always the ones who are condemning these things so dramatically. You know, they're condemning gay people who've been together for 20 years and want to get married because, ew, icky. But they're still, you know, they're actually, you know, raping their babysitter or something.
Yeah.
It's it's worse than hypocrisy. It's something beyond that. And it's really frightening, if I'm going to be honest.
That's really the problem with these people, and not just within these institutions, but in general, is that you know, the more power that you have as a figure, the more likely you are to abuse it, whether it be political power, whether it be institutional power, whether it maybe even whether it be intellectual or physical power.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, you're not wrong. It's not simple, and there's no simple answer.
Yeah.
But these systems, and this is again a case of, you know, don't judge a book by its cover when it's our book. Or don't judge a tree by its fruit when it's our tree. There are endless excuses for why this person or that person is an exception rather than the rule, even when all the evidence shows us, no, this is the rule. The very terrible, bad, no good rule.
Yeah.
So, good times. As for Mary, this is, you know, in the story, she does actually give consent, as it were. She says, you know, I am the handmaiden of the Lord. Let it be to me as you have said.
Well, I'm not sure if I remember the story quite correctly, but basically, I think the order in which it went down was basically the Holy Spirit comes to her, and the Holy Spirit then pretty much confronts her already with the facts, like, girl, you're gonna be impregnated with the Son of God, and then basically she's already confronted with the facts, and then she just says, well, yeah, okay, not the way of.
Yeah,
It's not like
there's
well,
the one version of the story is that Gabriel comes to her and says, you know what, you're gonna have God's kid. And she says, okay, sure, let's do that. That sounds fine. I'm okay with that, totally. And so, yeah, Gabriel does speak in the future tense in that version, as in the power of the Most High will overshadow you.
Yeah.
But again, this girl is a child.
Yeah.
And
my point was basically is that she wasn't really asked for consent. It was like, hey, the Holy Spirit came to her and said, well, or Gabriel came to her and said, hey, Mary, how are you? How would you feel about getting?
Yeah, she's
I'm cool with it, but she was basically confronted, and then she had
coerced, absolutely coerced. And that's an important point, because some people have pointed out, especially in the Luke version of the Nativity, that it really wouldn't be all that shocking for her to have a child when she says, I am a virgin. Big whoop, you're engaged. you're probably getting married quite soon. So what's the big deal with you're going to have a kid? It didn't say you're going to have a kid tomorrow. But that in fact, she might have been prepubescent, as in not even had a period yet.
Yeah.
And that, as much as I hate to say it, that's not an unreasonable reading of the text, especially when you take that in Luke, you have this sort of harmony of Elizabeth being her cousin, being the mother of John. There's a whole miraculous birth there where technically the woman is too old to have children.
Yeah.
But, God, so they have John the Baptist anyway. And then Mary is perhaps too young to have children, but God, so she has a baby anyway. And there's a disturbing sense to that, but there's also a very common literary sort of mirror image there.
Yeah. Basically, like, the mother of John was drunk, but nevertheless, God worked his ways, and Mary was too young, but nevertheless, God delivered.
Exactly. And so you have someone, if the story were true, you have someone who is overwhelmed by someone in a position of power and, coerced, really coerced, because we have to remember, if you talk a child into saying yes to something, that's not the same thing as it being the child's fault. It is possible to use your power to coerce people so that they don't really have a choice to say no, at least not safely. And that is not their fault. So very much it's a case of Me Too. It's abuse. And really, with a rapist God, I guess maybe there's something to that sense of spiritual authority. God is a rapist, so his most, virulent followers are apparently also prone to that.
Yeah. What I would call this sort of behavior within law would pretty much unironic or ironically what we would call that would be indirect perpetration of the crime, where he's basically God is using his superior position and his superior intellect and his superior powers in order to make her do something that she otherwise wouldn't agree to, and basically using her as a tool for fulfilling his goals, where she isn't fully aware of the full consequences of her actions, and she isn't really. She does really have and is not capable of forming an informed consent or an informed intent.
Yeah, and that's, we recognize that children cannot give informed consent, which is why statutory rape is a thing in civilized countries that are not run by religious law. Christianity isn't the only one that has had, shall we say, difficulty recognizing the importance of actual consent.
Yeah.
Islam, very similar in its attitudes towards consent and age and women essentially as property for all practical intents and purposes.
We're looking at you, Muhammad and Aisha.
Yeah. And I've heard interpretations that say, Aisha wasn't really that young. I'm like, yeah, there's still kids being forced into marriage on account of it. So I don't care. It's not okay. But what can I say? I'm sorry. Sometimes this is just the worst. It is exhausting. It's completely exhausting. And it's very frustrating. It's just emotionally crippling because I realize that even though I grew up in a sense understanding these, I had it so much better than so many people. Because my father was a good man, because he didn't want to abuse this system and was very set on not abusing it. I was safer as a result of that, not from Satan, but from people And from the abuses of the ideology that are so bloody natural to it.
Yeah, and from the inherently toxic system that we discussed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm sorry. This is just, honestly, it's a bit depressing, but it is, it's far less surprising than it should be to think of God as a rapist. Is that bad? I feel like that's bad.
I would say it's very bad because, I mean, in general, like you shouldn't be surprised that God is even a rapist. I mean, it's not like he didn't commit other violent acts that are very, very questionable from a moral perspective.
That's true. He even had that verse when basically he was punishing Israel again by letting them be conquered because it was totes their fault. Not at all that he's a total incompetent failure as a deity. And he said, you know, I remember basically when the men come and rape you that I'm the one lifting up your skirts for them.
Yeah. I mean, as far as the Christian God goes, all that needs to really be said is that he drowned children during the flood. And once you apply violence to children that may get them into the hospital or may even get them killed, then yeah, I don't find it to be a stretch that he would apply violence to a child in form of rape.
God, always a new and horrifying kind of asshole. Wow, I believed a lot of just fucked up stuff. Seriously.
Yeah.
On that note, did you have any further questions?
Not at the moment, I don't think. I think we pretty much have everything covered.
Well, everything we can think of right now. I know if there's one thing I can trust with God, there's always more horrifying shit to find. But in fairness, I think we've done our duty for today in exposing it. I just want to thank everyone who's come to listen. I know this has been a difficult episode, but thank you for your suggestions with topics, ideas. Thank you again to Leon for this comment because, hey, you were right. God is super rapey. And yeah, it would be very interesting to read Mary's expose on that topic. In the meantime, however, stay safe. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And reason bless.